Story 1. They called me in just after 7 p.m. while I was finishing a cup of black coffee in my kitchen. It was supposed to be my last night on duty. 37 years behind the wheel of a hearse, and this was how it would end. A call from the dispatcher I'd trained 3 managers ago, telling me there was one more delivery to make. Shouldn't take long, she said, as if death ever ran on time. The pickup was out in Cold Hollow, a little township east of Waverly Ridge. The place barely made the map. I'd been through there once in the 90s, remembered it for the crooked chapel, and the way the fog clung to the fields like wet wool. The man had no listed relatives, no obituary, no flowers ordered. No one even wanted to ride with the body. It was one of those municipal transfers, contracted by the county, closed casket, no ceremony, just paperwork and mileage. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. I didn't ask questions. That's one of the first things you learn in this job. Keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut. You're not paid to think about the dead. You're paid to move them. I rolled out of the garage by 8:30. The night was cold, quiet, windless. The kind of silence that makes a man feel like he's already halfway to the grave. I remember checking the rear view as I pulled onto the state road. Habit, I guess. But the cargo space was pitch black, and the old dome light hadn't worked in years. The ride to Cold Hollow was long and uneventful. 2-lane asphalt splitting fields and timberland. No lights for miles except the faded yellow of my own beams carving through the dark. I picked up the body from a facility that looked more like a tool shed than a morgue. The attendant didn't say much, just pointed to the steel gurney and handed me a clipboard. The man's name was Everett H. Tull. Age, unknown. Cause of death, pending. Even that struck me as odd. There was no pending in death. Either a man was dead, or he wasn't. But I signed the form, slid the casket into the back of the van, and locked it down like I'd done 1,000 times before. Except this time, the weight felt different. It wasn't just heavy, it was uneven. Like something inside had shifted wrong. My back caught it immediately. A subtle resistance when I lifted from the knees. Maybe it was the construction of the casket. Could have been the weather. Could have been my age. I told myself not to make anything of it. I double-checked the clamps, even padded the base with an extra blanket just to keep it steady. Still, as I drove off, the van sagged slightly on one side. I noticed it in the turns, how the suspension creaked louder than usual, how the weight dragged a little longer into the corners. The road back out of Cold Hollow cuts through some old farmland, barely paved in places, and with every mile, I felt more aware of the box behind me. Normally, I forget it's even there. That's the goal. You don't form thoughts around death, you just move it forward. But that night, with Everett H. Tull in the back, I felt it. Every bump, every shift in the van's center of gravity, like the thing wasn't resting, like something inside hadn't settled. I remember passing an old barn around midnight. Roof collapsed, no fence, the moon just a smear behind clouds, and the thought came uninvited. What if I'm not the only one awake back there? I turned up the heater, tried to distract myself with talk radio. Static, of course. You never get a signal out there, not unless you're looking for things you don't want to find. That's when I heard it. A dull knock, faint, metallic, from the rear. Could have been the axle, could have been the clamps, could have been my mind. But it was there just once, just loud enough to make me lower the volume. I kept driving. By 1:45 a.m., I was already planning to stop for gas and maybe a hot coffee. The route was empty, no taillights ahead, no headlights behind, just me and Everett. The hearse rattled a little when we passed over the wooden bridge outside Ridgefield. It always did. But that night, I swear the rattle had rhythm, not just mechanical, a kind of shuffle, a lurch, like a box being adjusted from the inside. I didn't stop. Not yet. I told myself again. Tires, road, stress, old bones. But in the rearview mirror, even through the dark, I could swear the outline of the casket had changed. Not by much. Just enough to make you question if it had always been that way. The worst part wasn't the sound. It wasn't the weight. It was the silence that followed. Thick and pressing, like someone holding their breath right behind your shoulder. I've done this long enough to know what silence means. When the dead are truly dead, there's nothing. Stillness, emptiness. But that night, it was different. That night, the silence felt full. and I still had 2 hours left on the road. I pulled into the old rest stop just past mile marker 62, a gas station that barely deserved the name, its fluorescent lights buzzing like angry flies, and only one pump still working, if you hit it right. I'd stopped there maybe a dozen times before on late runs, mostly for the vending machine coffee that tasted like burnt plastic but stayed hot, and the quiet lot where I could stretch my knees without questions. The lot was empty, save for a single pickup parked under a dead lamp and a trash bin overflowing with the evidence of long-haul boredom. Cigarette packs, crumpled fast food wrappers, a child's broken toy. I parked the van near the side of the building where the light was still on, left the engine running like always, and stepped out into the brittle air. The cold hit harder than expected. Sharp, dry, biting like it had teeth. I walked slowly, feeling the dull ache in my lower back from the weight I'd hauled earlier. 37 years of doing this, and I'd never needed a doctor to tell me where the stress settled. Knees, shoulders, lower spine. The body keeps the score. Inside, the place smelled like bleach and old candy. The man behind the counter didn't look up. Some kind of late-night security footage played behind him on a fuzzy screen. Empty hallways, flickering lights, motionless doors. I poured a small cup of the coffee and took it outside, cradling it in both hands. My breath rose in pale spirals. I didn't smoke, never did, but in moments like that, I always wished I had. Something about the ritual, I guess. The way it gives your hands a job when your thoughts won't sit still. I leaned against the van, facing the road, watching the occasional passing cloud blur out the moon. The silence was thicker here, less peaceful. I took a sip, scalding, bitter, familiar, and turned to get back in. That's when I saw it. The rear doors were still locked. I could tell by the angle of the latch. But the casket, something about it had changed. At first I couldn't say what, just a wrongness. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in placement. The covering cloth I'd draped over it was wrinkled now, gathered slightly at one edge like it had been moved and smoothed hastily. And the surface of the lid, which I distinctly remembered having a long scratch along the left side, something I'd noted absent-mindedly while loading, was now marked on the right. Not mirrored, not mistaken, shifted. I opened the back of the van, slowly. The locks clicked like they always did, metallic and clean. The air inside was still cold, maybe colder than outside, and smelled faintly of pine polish and steel. I stepped up, careful not to bump my head, and looked down at the casket. The metal handles were secure, the clamp straps tight, but something inside me stirred. Something quiet and instinctive, a kind of weight behind my sternum, like my body knew something before my mind caught up. I leaned in closer, eyes scanning for movement I knew I wouldn't see. Nothing. Just the same casket, the same covered lid, the same dead man I'd been hauling for hours. And yet, it didn't feel like the same space. It felt emptier, lighter. I got back in the driver's seat and sat for a minute before turning the key again. The engine hummed, but the vibration underfoot was different. Subtle, yes, but it was there. Less resistance. I nudged the van forward and pulled back onto the road. The incline just beyond the stop was gentle, familiar, but the hearse climbed it with less effort than before. The wheel felt looser. The engine didn't groan like it had with the extra weight. My foot barely needed to press down. Something was missing. I checked the side mirror out of habit. The windows in the rear were dark, as always. But the silhouette of the casket was different. Not shorter, not smaller, just shifted, off angle, like it had rotated ever so slightly during the stop. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was slipping, finally letting the years catch up with me. But the more I looked, the more it unsettled me. The worst of it? I didn't feel alone. I'd spent half my life transporting the dead across counties and borders, over rivers and through farmland, past sleeping towns and trucker cafes. And never, not once, had I felt what I felt then. Not grief, not dread, not even fear. Not yet. Just presence. As if the back of the hearse was no longer occupied by something still. As if Everett H. Tull wasn't resting back there, but waiting, or watching, or worse, moving. I drove on, trying not to glance in the mirror again. But I did. I always do. And what I thought I saw in the reflection wasn't movement. Not yet. But the cloth was different. Bunched near the foot now, folded like a sleeve pushed back by an elbow. I gripped the wheel and didn't stop until the trees closed in again and the road disappeared into black. The road narrowed past the state line, turning into a kind of winding corridor carved through the dark. Trees leaned in from both sides, tall and thin, and clustered so tight they blocked out the moonlight completely. There were no more road signs, no distance markers, no painted lines, just the dull hum of the wheels against the asphalt and the sound of my own pulse building behind my ears. I'd been driving for over 3 hours at that point, and fatigue had settled in like rust on a tool left out too long. My shoulders ached. My right ankle cramped every few minutes, the pedal pressure keeping it locked in the same subtle tension. But none of that compared to the weight I felt pressing behind me. Not on my back, not on the seat, but in the space. That empty rear cargo space where Everett H. Tull was supposed to be lying still, secured, sealed, inert. But I could feel something shift again. I didn't hear it this time. I felt it. The hearse swayed, not in rhythm with the curve of the road, but just after. A lag, a hesitation, like something inside took a moment to catch up. It was subtle, the kind of thing you dismiss if you want to keep your world in one piece. But I'd been in this van too long to lie to myself. And then, as if testing my nerve, the road leveled out, a long, straight stretch through a stretch of empty farmland. No hills, no turns, no distractions. And that's when I looked up into the mirror. The rear of the hearse was dim, barely illuminated by the faint red glow of the dash lights bouncing off the interior. But there was enough. Enough to see the shape, the outline of the casket. It had moved. I know it had. The head of the casket had always been to the left. I remember that from when I loaded it, head first, feet toward the rear doors. But now in the mirror, it looked turned, just slightly, maybe 20 degrees off center, but not how I left it. And then I saw it. The lid, shut when I picked it up, locked when I left the gas station, was cracked open. Not wide, not swinging, just enough to break the seal, a few inches, enough to catch the light along the seam. Enough to reveal what was inside. And Everett H. Tull wasn't lying flat. He was turned, on his side, facing the passenger side wall of the hearse, his suit jacket crumpled under one shoulder. His hand, God help me, was up near his chest, clenched slightly. Not open, not limp, like it had curled recently. Reflexively, I slammed the brakes. The tires screamed. The van lurched. The coffee cup from earlier hit the dash and bounced to the floor. I didn't think. I didn't even breathe. I jumped out, nearly tripping on the gravel shoulder, and yanked open the rear door so hard, one of the latches popped back against the hinge. The cold air hit me like a slap. I grabbed the flashlight from the side mount and shone it inside. The casket was exactly where I'd left it, centered, strapped, closed. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped up into the compartment, hand trembling as I ran the light along the edges. The lid was flush. No gap. No opening. I checked the clamp, still sealed. But as I looked closer, I saw something that made my knees go soft. The interior handle, those little bars they install for lifting, had scratch marks on the opposite side from where I remembered them. Long, curved grooves in the inner wood, as if fingernails had scraped them. 4 distinct arcs, right where the left hand of the body would have been. Only now the marks were on the other side. I hadn't touched that side. No one had. And more than that, there was a faint, greasy smear across the satin lining, like the residue left behind by sweat. Fresh. I climbed back out, slowly, unable to speak even to myself. My hands felt numb. I closed the doors softer this time, as if afraid of being overheard. I stood there a while, the flashlight now off, my eyes adjusting to the emptiness of the road. Nothing moved. No cars passed. The world was still. I should have turned around. Should have called the funeral home, or the state police, or someone, but I didn't. I got back in, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. Because that's what you do. You keep moving forward. You pretend you didn't see what you saw. You let the job swallow it for you. But the rest of that ride, I didn't look in the mirror again. Not once. And I didn't play the radio. I needed to hear if something moved. I reached the cemetery just before dawn. The sky was the color of unpolished steel, thick with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to rain or just press down harder. Fog had gathered low across the grass, clinging to the ground like it had roots. It was the kind of cemetery people forget exists, off a gravel road with no signs, no gates, no stone angels perched on corners. Just a rusted chain-link fence half swallowed by weeds and a small shack near the tree line that passed for an office. The van crunched to a stop along the side path, the engine ticking in the cold as I let it idle, my fingers still wrapped tight around the steering wheel. I hadn't looked in the mirror for over an hour, and I wasn't about to start now. Not after what I'd seen. Not after how still the back had become again. Like whatever was back there had either gone back to sleep or finished what it started. I stepped out and walked slowly toward the shack. The man inside looked like he'd been poured into his uniform. Too thin for the sleeves, too hollow in the face. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just opened the door and stared. His badge said C, Latham, and his eyes said he didn't want to be there. I cleared my throat and handed him the transport papers. "Delivery for a Mr. Everett H. Tull," I said, like I'd said 100 times for 100 other names. But he didn't reach for the clipboard, just kept staring at the window behind me. "What time did you leave the pickup site?" he asked quietly, voice like gravel under a boot. I told him. He didn't write it down. Just stepped over to the filing cabinet, flipped a few pages in a manila folder, and paused longer than he should have. I could see the confusion settle behind his expression, then something else. Not surprise, not alarm, recognition. He turned back toward me, slower this time. "What did you say the name was again?" I repeated it. He nodded, barely, then walked over to the landline phone on the desk. He picked it up, dialed a number, listened, and then hung up without saying a word. "We'll take it from here," he muttered, gesturing toward the back field. "Plots prepared, northwest corner, no headstone yet." I stood there for a second, unsure if I'd missed something. "You need me to sign anything?" I asked. He didn't answer, just slid a blank form across the counter. I looked down. No name, no time, no death certificate number. Just a line for my signature. I hesitated, then signed it, because I didn't want to ask, because I didn't want to know. I walked back to the van and opened the rear doors. The casket was still there, still sealed, still strapped, still wrong. I released the clamps, slid it onto the gurney, and rolled it out alone. Normally there'd be someone to help guide it. Normally someone would meet you at the plot, but no one came. Latham didn't follow. No groundskeepers appeared. Just me, the fog, and the dead. I rolled it down the overgrown path toward the northwest corner, the wheels stuck in the soft earth. My hands trembled more than the terrain justified, and when I reached the hole, a narrow rectangle cut into the ground, deeper than usual, I paused. There were no flowers, no priest, no mourners, no dates, just a void in the ground that looked older than it should have. The dirt around it packed too tight, like it had been waiting longer than a day. I lowered the casket in slowly, quietly, the pulley system creaking like bones in winter. And when it hit bottom, I swear I heard a hollow knock. Not the sound of impact, the sound of reply. I stood there longer than I should have, holding the straps, heart thudding in my ears. I waited for something to move, for something to breathe, but nothing came. So I turned and walked back toward the shack. Latham was gone. Door closed. Light off. The form I'd signed still on the counter, but now half covered with a stack of unrelated files. I knocked once. No answer. I didn't knock again. Back in the van, I sat for a long time before starting the engine. My fingers hovered over the key like it was something foreign, and when I finally turned it, the van sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. I didn't check the rearview mirror. Not once. I just drove. And even as I turned onto the main road and saw the sun rising behind the treetops, even as the fog began to burn off and the warmth started to return to the world, something didn't feel finished. When I got back to the funeral home, the manager met me in the lot. "Everything go all right?" she asked, distracted, halfway through her checklist. "Yeah," I lied. "No problems." She took the clipboard from my hand and paused. "Where's the file?" "I left it at the cemetery," I said. "They didn't seem to need it." She shrugged and walked off. That night I checked the transport system. Every body logged, Every signature stored, every route archived, but Everett H. Tull wasn't listed. Not under T, not under E, not under unclaimed. His case file had been purged. No transfer logged, no death record attached. Like he'd never existed, or like someone didn't want him to. And still, in the back of my mind, I could feel that silence from the ride settle into something colder, something permanent. I tried to let it go, told myself it was just another job, another strange night in a long line of strange nights. The kind you collect after decades in a business no one really wants to talk about. But I knew it wasn't over. Not really. Not with how quiet the drive home had been, not with how empty the records felt, and especially not with how the van had started to smell. It began 2 days later, faint at first. A sour metallic tang that clung to the air like old blood under a floorboard. I thought maybe the weather was turning. Maybe moisture had gotten into the rear insulation. It's happened before. Cars that sit too long pick up smells. But this wasn't mildew or gasoline or the ghosts of pine polish and leather. This was sharper, more specific, like something had been left behind. I pulled the van into the wash bay behind the funeral home, scrubbed every inch of the interior myself. I used industrial disinfectants, bleach wipes, the vacuum hose for every corner. I opened the back wide and let it air out under the midday sun for hours. But the smell didn't fade. If anything, it seemed stronger when I closed the doors again, like it had been hiding in the dark and was now awake. That night I went to check it one last time before turning in. The lot was silent, the sky clear, stars hanging low and distant like ash on a black sheet. I unlocked the rear doors, stepped up inside, and immediately felt it. Something cold and pressing. The kind of cold that doesn't come from weather. It came from the space itself. I reached for the interior lights, but they flickered once and died. I swept my flashlight across the floor and paused. In the far corner, behind the metal divider that separates the main compartment from the equipment storage, something was wedged between the frame and the wall. A small object, wrapped in fabric. I pulled it out, slowly, hands numb before I even touched it. It was a cloth sack, heavy, dusty, cinched with an old string. I opened it, expecting old tools or maybe a lost item from months before. But inside was a black wool jacket, folded tight. The same jacket Everett H. Tull had been buried in. The same lapel, the same tear at the cuff I'd noticed when loading the casket. I stared at it, not moving, not breathing, then ran my hand along the lining and found something hard in the pocket, a brass nameplate, small, worn. I turned it over in my palm, and there it was, EHT. My chest tightened, my eyes burned. I sat down on the step of the van, jacket still in my hand, the night around me growing heavy. I wanted to scream, to throw the thing into the woods and never speak of it again, but I didn't. I just sat there, listening, and that's when I heard it, a soft knock, from inside the wall panel. It was small, delicate, like fingertips brushing wood. Then came another, louder, more certain. I stood, slowly, stepped back into the compartment, and pressed my ear to the aluminum frame. There it was again. 3 knocks, then silence. I reported nothing, told no one. The next morning, I handed the van off to the day shift and walked home. Said I wasn't feeling well, that I'd start the paperwork for retirement early. They didn't question it, but the van didn't stay quiet. The night watchman mentioned noises, a tapping sound, sometimes movement. The engine failed to start twice in a week, despite a full battery. The back doors unlocked themselves once, and when I returned a few nights later, just to check it one more time, I opened the rear and found the straps had been removed, folded neatly, set on the floor, as if whatever was there had no further use for them. I asked about Latham, the man at the cemetery. No one by that name worked there. No records, no logs. I called the county, asked about the contract delivery. They said no such transfer was authorized, that no such body had been assigned to me that week. And yet, I still had the nameplate, still had the jacket, still had the smell on my clothes, faint and sour like it had gotten into my skin. The van stopped working entirely last week. Engine won't turn. The battery's fine. Electrical's intact, but it sits in the lot, unmoving, locked from the inside. No one wants to tow it. No one wants to open it, but I still hear it sometimes, late at night, just as I'm drifting off. A soft metallic knock, like fingers tapping a coffin wall, or something waiting in the dark, not trying to get out, just reminding me it never really left. I drove the dead for almost 4 decades. I learned not to question what didn't make sense, but I never believed in anything I couldn't see. Not until Everett H. Tull. Not until that night. Now I believe one thing. The dead can move, and sometimes they don't like where you leave them. Story 2. It started with the phone call. Not the kind that jolts you awake in a cold sweat, but the kind that slips quietly into the evening, disguised as routine. I was in the garage, wiping down the sides of the hearse, my hands moving slow over the cold metal, the way they always did after a long day. The sun had already slipped beneath the horizon, and the shop was closing up. I wasn't on call. I hadn't been on call in over 6 months. After 35 years behind the wheel, I'd finally started stepping back, taking fewer shifts, easing into whatever came after death no longer rode in my rear view. But then, the phone rang. The screen showed the number from dispatch. Same line we've had since the early 90s. Same ringtone, same sense of expectation. So I answered, out of habit more than anything else. The voice on the other end was male, low, neutral, with no real accent. "Urgent transfer," he said. "One-way pickup. Night service. No delay." He gave me an address in the older quarter of the city, Ash Grove Heights, the part with cobbled streets and houses that still breathe the dust of their own walls. It struck me as strange. We almost never serviced that area anymore. Most of the funeral homes there had closed down or consolidated into the larger franchises, but the caller gave the code we use for approved contracts, and the tone in his voice didn't leave room for questions. Still, something about the way he said my name didn't sit right. Not wrong, just slightly off, like a recording played a notch too slow. I asked for the name of the deceased. There was a pause. Then, "All documents will be on site. Just get there." Then the line went dead. I stood there a moment, the phone still in my hand, unsure why I hadn't pushed back. Maybe it was the old reflexes. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something deeper, something older. Like I owed one more ride to someone who couldn't be ignored. Either way, I unlocked the hearse, turned the key, and let the engine rumble to life. The headlights cut through the creeping dark like search beams over a battlefield, illuminating dust that wasn't there seconds ago. I slid into the driver's seat, checked the glove box for a blank manifest, and pulled out onto the road without telling anyone where I was headed. No paperwork, no backup, no questions. The city always looks different at night, but Ash Grove Heights looks like it never left the night to begin with. The brick sidewalks had cracks wide enough to catch a boot heel, and the gas lamps, some still burning, others long extinguished, cast the kind of uneven light that makes you feel like you're always being watched. I followed the GPS through a tight series of turns until it pointed me toward a funeral home I hadn't seen in over a decade. Dunlow and Sons, or what was left of it. The sign was crooked, half-lit, the letters barely clinging to the frame. The front steps had weeds growing between the stones, and the large wooden doors stood slightly ajar, as if they'd been waiting. I parked on the curb. No other cars in sight. No traffic. No wind. Just the deep, quiet stillness of a place that had forgotten time. I stepped out, clipboard in hand, and made my way toward the entrance. Something about the air felt thick, heavier than it should have been for early spring. I expected the familiar smell of incense and flowers, but there was nothing, not even dust, just silence. Inside, the building was dimly lit. No staff, no receptionist, no one in sight. The only light came from down the hall, through a narrow corridor that led to the viewing room. I knew the layout. Most of these old funeral homes shared the same floor plan. Entry, office, chapel, viewing, preparation. But something about the way this one felt beneath my boots made me slow my pace. The floor didn't creak. It sighed. I reached the doorway to the viewing room and paused. The air was cooler there, stiller. A long row of pews faced a single casket at the front, bathed in a soft golden light from an overhead lamp. Around a dozen people sat silently, spaced apart, all dressed in dark clothes. They didn't speak, they didn't move, and none of them turned to look at me. I expected someone to acknowledge my arrival. After all, I was there for the pickup, but no one did. I stepped forward slowly, boots clicking softly against the polished floor. I glanced around for a staff member, a sign-in sheet, anything. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of a building trying to remember how to function. Then I looked toward the casket. It was open. And though I couldn't yet see the face, I felt something seize inside me. A tightening in the chest, a grip around the throat. I took another step, and then another, until I was close enough to see the small brass placard fixed neatly to the center of the casket lid. The name engraved there was clear, sharp, precise. It was mine. Full name, middle initial, spelled exactly as I spell it. Date of birth, location of residence, and beneath it, carved neatly in a smaller font, the date of death, yesterday. At first, I didn't move. I just stood there, rooted to the floor like the wood had grown hands and clutched my boots. My eyes didn't leave the placard, as if by staring long enough I could make the letters rearrange into something more reasonable. Some other name, some mistake in spelling, some error of protocol, but it didn't change. My name was there, all of it. First, middle, last. Even the uncommon hyphen in my surname, the one most people forget to write. And the date, my date of birth, was correct to the number, down to the same spring afternoon in 1963, when my mother had told me it rained for 5 minutes, and then cleared just in time for the drive home. Below it, cold and clean, sat the date of death, the day before, yesterday. A day I remembered, a day I lived. I remembered washing the hearse, remembered my coffee, remembered picking up the phone and taking the call, remembered getting in the driver's seat and coming here. I remembered everything. And yet, there it was, written in polished brass, as if remembering it had never mattered. I took a breath, shallow, uneven, and stepped closer to the casket. The flowers beside it were wilted, not fresh like they should have been for a recent service. They looked old, like they'd been placed days ago and forgotten. A mix of white lilies and small chrysanthemums, petals curled inward like they were trying to escape the stems. The scent was faint, bitter, not quite decay, but not life either. I looked down the aisle again, expecting, hoping that someone would stand, turn, explain. But the people remained still. 12 of them. No one I recognized at first glance. All of them sat in a kind of postured sorrow, the kind that didn't shift or breathe. Their hands folded, their shoulders heavy, but none wept, none whispered. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. I cleared my throat softly, testing the air. No reaction. I took another step toward the casket, this time close enough to reach out and touch the lid if I wanted to. My fingers hesitated in the air, but I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I looked up at the ceiling. The light was dim, flickering just slightly at the edges. A fan spun lazily in the corner, too slow to be of use. And the air was heavy again. That pressure returned, the same I'd felt when I first stepped inside. It settled on the back of my neck, crawled down the spine, wrapped itself around the base of my ribs. A quiet compression, as if the room had shrunk while I wasn't looking. I turned finally toward the people, faces now slightly more familiar. One of them, I could swear, was the florist who used to deliver weekly to our chapel. Another looked like a nurse I remembered from county hospital, the one who cried when she had to admit her father. And there, 2 rows back, I saw someone I hadn't seen in years. Marcus, my old assistant, fired in 2009 for drinking on the job. But he looked younger now, thinner, sharper in the face. He stared at me, but didn't seem to see me. His eyes were pointed in my direction, but without recognition, without presence. And still, no one spoke. I turned back to the casket and finally laid a hand on the lid. It was cold, colder than it should have been under the soft lights. I leaned forward and whispered, as if to no one in particular, "This isn't funny." My voice didn't echo. It felt absorbed, eaten by the walls before it had time to linger. I expected something then. Movement, a response, even laughter, anything. But the room stayed as it was, mute and unmoved. I looked again at the nameplate. It hadn't changed. There was no error, no duplication. It was mine, and somewhere in the deepest part of me, something shifted. Not panic, not yet. Just the early cracks of realization, like the faint pop of frozen wood before it splits. I stepped back, slowly, heart drumming harder now. Not in terror, but in confusion that tasted too much like grief. I looked down the rows one last time, and for the briefest moment, thought I saw someone nod. Just once, then stillness again. And I wasn't sure anymore if I was here for work, or if I had arrived too late for my own goodbye. I tried to speak again, this time louder. "Hello?" I said, projecting my voice toward the pews. It wasn't a shout, but it carried. Enough that someone should have looked up. Enough that someone should have reacted. But no one did. The figures remained still, hands folded in their laps, eyes either cast downward or staring ahead with that fixed, empty gaze that comes not from mourning, but from waiting. And the strange part was, not one face showed confusion. No furrowed brows, no startled glances. They weren't surprised to see me. They just didn't acknowledge I was there. As if I were no more unusual than the candles burning low on the back wall or the faded drapes swaying slightly despite the still air. I stepped sideways, making a deliberate movement across the aisle to test their eyes. Still nothing. Their focus never shifted. I was beginning to feel the room tighten around me. Not physically, not in walls or space, but in presence. I was there. I could hear the sound of my own breath, feel the ache in my knees from standing too long, the tacky dryness in my mouth from that gas station coffee earlier. I was present, and yet I wasn't received. That word landed in my mind without permission. Received. Like they knew I'd come, but not in the way I thought. Not as a worker, not as someone helping, but as someone expected. I walked slowly down the row, eyes scanning the faces. I kept looking for something familiar, something warm or human or even slightly broken. Grief is messy. It leaks. It curls the spine and reddens the eyes. But these people, they were composed, almost rehearsed, like actors in a scene they'd already performed 100 times. I paused beside the woman I thought I recognized. Linda, that was her name. She used to work weekends at the funeral home, handling reception when the rest of us were stretched thin. She was kind, always quick with a joke, always remembered to put extra sugar in the coffee when she knew I was coming in early. And yet, now, she sat rigid, dressed in black, her hair pinned exactly as I remembered it from 15 years ago. She didn't turn her head, didn't blink, just stared at the casket as though the room didn't contain anyone else. I leaned down slightly, close enough that my shadow fell over her hands. "Linda," I whispered. Nothing. My voice didn't stir her, but I saw her fingers twitch. Just once. A small, involuntary spasm, like the body flinching in response to something the mind couldn't process. I said her name again, firmer this time. Her jaw clenched. Then slowly, she turned her head, and her eyes met mine. For a moment I thought it had worked, that the spell or silence or whatever had frozen this room had cracked just enough. But her expression was not one of recognition. It was terror. Not confusion, not surprise. Terror. Her pupils widened, her lips trembled, and she whispered something so soft I almost missed it. "This can't be happening," she said. "Not again." Then she turned away and covered her face with her hands, shaking her head, mouthing something silently like a prayer or a plea. I stood there, cold rising up my spine like water in a sinking boat. What did she mean? Not again? Had she seen this before? Me before? I looked back toward the rest of the mourners. Some had shifted slightly. One man near the front wiped at his face. A woman in the back dabbed her eyes. A few looked in my direction now, but not at me, through me. Their expressions were not ones of alarm, but of resignation, like they knew I would be there, like they had already accepted it. I backed away slowly. My legs felt weak, like the floor had turned to sand under my boots. I stepped toward the hallway again, toward the lobby. I needed a mirror, a file, a reason, something to anchor this moment to reality, because my own memories were still clear, still intact. I remembered the call. I remembered the address. I remembered the engine rumbling under my hands, the weight of the steering wheel, the hiss of the road as I rolled through Ashgrove Heights. I remembered being alive, and yet, with every passing minute, this room looked less like a place of work and more like a place of passage, the kind you don't leave. The kind you don't question once you cross the threshold. I stopped near the entrance, turned around one last time and saw them all standing now. All 12. Faces still solemn, still hollow. And all of them were looking at the casket. Not at me. At it. At what was inside. And I knew then, in a way words can't capture, that I was no longer seen as a man doing his job. I was the job. I didn't want to look. I told myself it was a mistake, a cruel one, elaborate and pointless, but explainable. Some clerical error, some sick prank by a disgruntled ex-employee, some hallucination born from exhaustion. But deep down, I knew none of that would hold. Not with how the air felt thicker with every breath, not with how the lights dimmed just slightly when I turned back toward the front of the room. Not with the way Linda had looked at me like I'd stepped out of her nightmares. The mourners stood still, silent, their faces fixed on the casket again, as if nothing had just happened. As if their moment of movement had simply been a ripple in an otherwise still lake, now smoothed over by inevitability. I walked forward, slow and deliberate, each step louder than it should have been, like the sound of my boots was echoing through a space no longer fully mine. My fingers trembled as I reached the side of the casket. The light above buzzed faintly, flickering for the first time since I'd arrived. I stood there, heart knocking against my ribs like it wanted out, and leaned slightly forward to peer inside. There I was. I say that now with the certainty only time can give. In that moment, I still tried to deny it. I still tried to rationalize. I told myself it only looked like me. The same face, yes, but death has a way of distorting features, softening edges, closing eyes in strange ways. But it wasn't just the face. It was the small scar above the right eyebrow from when I fell off my bike at 11, the slight bend in the nose from a bar fight in my 20s, the roughness in the knuckles from years of gripping a steering wheel and lifting caskets into the backs of vans. Even the suit was mine, dark navy, pinstriped, a bit outdated, the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral and never wore again, but it had still been in my closet that morning. I remembered seeing it hanging there, tucked in plastic, yellowed slightly at the edges, and yet now here it was, wrapped around the lifeless body that wore my face, hands folded on its chest, expression calm, too calm. I leaned in further, trying to catch a flaw, an error, something to snap the illusion. My breath clouded slightly on the edge of the open lid, and the chill from inside reached my face. It was colder than any body should be. Colder than the refrigeration units in the prep rooms. Cold like something left too long outside time. My fingers hovered over the lining. I didn't want to touch it. God, I didn't. But something in me said I had to. That if I didn't, I'd leave that room still wondering. I reached in, fingertips grazing the edge of the sleeve. The fabric felt familiar, and then I touched the skin. The vertigo hit me like a punch to the spine. Everything inside shifted. My stomach flipped. The room tilted left and then right. I stumbled back, the world blurring, sounds dropping out like someone had flicked a switch. I couldn't hear my own breath. Couldn't hear the creak of the floor, or the hum of the light, or the rustle of the mourner's clothes. Just a high, shrill whine like pressure building in my ears. I stumbled toward the side hallway, half falling into the wall, using it to guide myself. I needed a mirror. I don't know why. That word just rang through my head. Mirror. I needed to see. Needed to confirm that I was still there, still visible, still whole. The bathroom was past the old supply closet, exactly where I remembered it. The door creaked open with the same groan I'd heard a dozen times in the past. I flipped the switch. The overhead light buzzed weakly to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked tiles and dusty fixtures. I stepped in front of the mirror. There was nothing, no reflection. The sink was there, the wall behind me, even the flickering light fixture above. But I wasn't. I turned sideways, then fully around. Still nothing. I waved my hand in front of where my face should be, and only saw the empty room. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my hands against the counter, staring into that void, trying to will something into existence. But it was gone. I was gone. I stumbled backward, out of the bathroom, back into the hallway. My legs moved on their own now, not toward the front, not toward the exit, but back into the viewing room. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the oxygen itself didn't want to be breathed. The mourners were all seated again. They hadn't moved while I was gone. Their heads bowed, their hands still, and the casket was closed. I hadn't closed it. No one had. I stood there trembling, watching as one of the attendants appeared from the hallway I hadn't seen before. Tall, lean, dressed in black, face obscured by the low light. He stepped forward without acknowledging me, picked up the guest book, and placed it gently into a leather bag. One by one, the mourners began to rise and file out, heads still low, faces unreadable. No one spoke. No one looked at me. I stood alone with the casket as the last light above flickered, and the door to the hallway clicked shut behind them. The room grew darker, the air colder, and I realized I was no longer there to retrieve the body. I was the one they had come to bury. I don't remember walking to the hearse. I don't remember pushing the doors open or stepping out into the street or hearing the faint echo of footsteps behind me. I only remember the weight, heavy and strange, settling into my chest as I stood beside the vehicle I had driven for over half my life. The sky above was colorless, not dark or light, just empty, as though the night had decided it no longer needed to play at stars or moon or weather. I opened the door and slid behind the wheel, my hands finding the grooves in the leather without thought. The keys were already in the ignition. No one had placed them there, but they were warm to the touch, like they'd never left. When I turned the key, the engine rumbled to life. Not the familiar cough of overused machinery, but something quieter, smoother, like the machine was humming to itself. The dashboard glowed faintly, the same pale green it always had. But something was different. The GPS screen, which hadn't worked properly in years, lit up with a soft pulse. One destination marked in red. No address, no coordinates, just a single word, home. I didn't question it. I didn't touch the screen or adjust the route. I shifted into drive and let the hearse ease out onto the narrow street. The city was silent, not asleep, silent. No cars, no headlights, no blinking traffic lights or storefront signs. Just the soft whisper of tires on pavement and the occasional flicker of tree branches swaying in wind that didn't touch the skin. I passed buildings I knew, but they looked older now, as though time had peeled away their facades to reveal the bones beneath. Some were boarded up. Others stood half swallowed by ivy, as if nature had decided it was time to reclaim them. The GPS directed me north, through streets I hadn't taken in years, into the outskirts of town, past Hollow Bend, past the water tower with the faded lettering, past the road where I used to take lunch in the shade. Each turn felt like a closing door, each mile a deeper step into a place I had always avoided without knowing why. And then I saw it. Maple Grove Cemetery, the old one, the one where I worked my first year on the job, where the stones leaned like tired men and the trees hung low enough to brush the rooftops of passing hearses, where I once buried a child so small the casket fit in my arms like a crate, where I watched snow fall on fresh soil and felt, for the first time, the weight of what I was part of. The gates stood open, rusted hinges groaned as I passed through, and the headlights swept across rows of crooked markers. No sign of anyone, no caretaker's shed lit, no other vehicles, just the gravel path winding toward the far northwest corner, where the older graves slept. I followed it, slow and steady, every bump a memory, every jolt a breath held too long. When I reached the spot, I didn't need the GPS to confirm it. The plot was already open. The earth had been dug with care, clean sides, fresh soil piled neatly beside the hole. A single lantern flickered nearby, casting a long shadow across the mound, and beside it stood a man, not young, not old, dressed in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded most of his face. He didn't move when I stepped out, didn't speak, just watched. I walked toward him, the cold no longer biting, just there, a companion more than a warning. When I reached the edge of the grave, he turned slightly, enough that I could see the side of his face. Familiar, not like someone I knew in life, but like someone I had seen before, in mirrors, in windows, in flashes of light against dark glass. "Took you long enough," he said. I didn't respond. What could I say? He nodded toward the open grave. "It's ready," and I knew what he meant. There was no need for lifting, no need for pallbearers or straps or final words. The casket was already in place, closed, waiting. My name etched into the plaque now felt Still, settled. Not a warning, not a threat. Just a truth finally carved in stone. I stepped closer, looked down into the earth and saw nothing. Not the casket, not the bottom. Just darkness, deep and complete. The man placed a hand on my shoulder. It was warm. "Go on," he said. "You already made the drive." I nodded. And then I stepped down. I don't remember falling. I don't remember the soil closing overhead, but I remember the sound of the hearse door shutting, the engine starting, and the long drive back. Empty. Story 3. 17 years I've been doing this. Funeral work isn't something you fall into by accident. Not this kind. Not the kind where you drive bodies through the night while the rest of the world sleeps. You either last, or you don't. Most burn out after 2 or 3 years, and I can't blame them. The silence gets to you. The weight in the back seat that never answers when you talk to it. The roads you travel where no one waves, where headlights seem like an intrusion. But I lasted. I never missed a shift. Never dropped a casket. Never asked more questions than I was supposed to. My name stayed on the preferred list for longer than anyone else I knew. And because of that, when the dispatcher called me at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, I answered without hesitation. Even though my shift had ended hours ago, even though my boots were off and I'd just poured a whiskey. The voice on the other end wasn't the usual one. Female, but flat. Robotic. No greeting. Just a string of instructions. One body, already prepared. Pick up from the depot. Destination, Pine Hill Cemetery, Northern Gate. No family listed. No time window. Immediate transfer. She said the body would be ready at Dock 3A. I asked for the name, the release form, the tag number. She paused. "No identification available," she said. "Special protocol. You'll find written instructions with the delivery." I should have stopped her there. Should have asked who authorized it, which funeral director signed off. But 17 years on the job makes a man obedient. Makes you believe that if you've followed the routine this long without incident, the moment you start questioning it is the moment it all unravels. So I said, "Copy that," and she hung up without saying goodbye. No click, no static, just gone. The depot was quiet when I arrived. That wasn't unusual. It's always quiet after midnight. But the quiet felt different this time. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness, like the place was holding its breath. The exterior lights were on, casting their usual pale orange glow over the asphalt and the delivery ramp. I parked, climbed out, and walked around to 3A, expecting someone to meet me. No one was there. No clipboard on the wall, no logbook, just the casket already sitting on the dolly, positioned at the base of the dock as if it had been left in a hurry. A standard model, matte black with chrome trim, the kind they reserve for unclaimed or indigent cases. There was no toe tag on the handle, no medical transport sticker, no paper envelope with forms, just a single folded sheet typed in block letters and taped to the lid. Pine Hill Cemetery, Northern Entrance, Row 19, Plot 3, deliver before sunrise. That was it. No signature, no header, no agency seal or file number. Just those 4 lines, printed clean, taped precisely in the center. I stared at it longer than I needed to. Something about the paper felt wrong. Not aged, not smudged, but clinical. Sterile in a way even hospitals don't achieve. Like it hadn't been printed on a normal machine. Like it had always just existed that way. Still, I loaded the casket, rolled it carefully up the ramp, secured it inside the hearse with the same triple lock rig I always used, checked the clamps, pulled the sheet from the lid, and folded it neatly into my pocket. The metal of the casket felt colder than usual, not just from the night air, but from within. I've touched enough of them to know. This one held a stillness that didn't belong to death. It felt lighter somehow, but denser at the same time. Hollow in sound, but heavy in presence. As I climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door closed, I reached for the radio out of habit, but hesitated. I couldn't remember if the dispatcher had mentioned calling back to confirm. I turned the knob, but the line was dead. No static, just silence. The GPS screen had already powered on and displayed the destination. Pine Hill, Northern Gate. I didn't program it. I didn't have to. I'd been there more times than I could count. I started the engine. The headlights cut across the pavement, catching the edge of a newspaper blowing weakly in the wind. No other cars, no workers. The depot door now closed behind me, though I hadn't heard it move. I backed out slowly and turned onto the main road, merging into darkness like slipping into a familiar coat. The city lights faded behind me within minutes. It was late, but not that late, and yet the roads were deserted, the kind of empty that doesn't feel safe. I glanced in the rear view out of instinct. The casket sat perfectly still, no shift, no creak, but I still felt it, that faint pressure, like something was inside the hearse that wasn't just a body, like something knew the route better than I did. The streetlights thinned out the farther north I went. Buildings gave way to trees, trees to open land to the edge of what people still called civilization. And up ahead, miles down that long stretch of nothing, the cemetery waited. I told myself it was just one more delivery, but even as I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about that folded paper in my pocket, about the way it didn't ask for a name, because in 17 years of doing this, I'd never once delivered someone who didn't have a name, until that night. The road to Pine Hill had never felt long. Even after a full shift, even after a double back-to-back, I could make the trip half asleep if I had to. It was routine, stitched into the muscle memory of my hands, the lean of the wheel, the feel of the curves between the old watermill and the iron gates. But that night, the road felt stretched, like someone had unspooled it longer behind the hills. It wasn't just empty, it was wrong. I passed intersections where signs should have stood, but didn't. Stoplights that never changed. Gas stations that looked closed even though their windows were lit from within. One of them had a flickering neon sign that read, "Coffee," in a loop, but no one behind the glass. Not even a shadow. I drove past without slowing. The farther I went, the more the night pressed in. Not dark like a lack of light, but dark like something that had filled the space where light should have been. I remember the first time I delivered to Pine Hill. I was 27, green behind the ears, and driving a borrowed hearse that smelled like old cigarettes and mildew. Back then, the place felt like any other cemetery. Quiet, solemn, surrounded by a metal fence and lit by 6 high posts that glowed yellow no matter the season. There was always someone in the gatehouse, an older man named Roy, who kept peppermints in his shirt pocket and called everyone Kid. That was years ago. Roy had died. Others had come and gone, but the place stayed the same, until now. As I turned onto the final stretch of road, where the trees opened and the gravel began, I slowed automatically, waiting for the lights to appear over the ridge and the iron gates to shimmer in the fog. But there were no lights. The trees kept getting denser, closing in from either side, and when I finally rolled to a stop at the entrance, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not quiet, silence, the kind that devours sound. Even the engine seemed muted. I shifted into park and stepped out. Gravel crunched under my boots, but only barely, like the earth didn't want to make noise anymore. The gates were open. Not swung wide like usual, but slightly ajar, just enough for the hearse to fit through. One hinge had rusted so completely it leaned against the frame like it was waiting to give up. No one was in the gatehouse. The windows were dark, the door slightly open. I stepped closer and peeked inside. Empty. The desk still had papers, but no radio, no coat on the hook, no coffee mug, just a chair that had been turned toward the window, as if someone had been watching, waiting, and never stood up. I felt it then, the sense that I wasn't entirely alone, but also not being watched in the usual way. It was more like the cemetery itself had become aware that I was back, that I had brought something, or maybe returned something. I got back into the hearse, eased it through the gate, and followed the inner path toward the northern field. The main floodlights that usually bathed the grounds were off. The only light came from the moon, or something like it, casting everything in pale silver. The trees lining the edges seemed taller, wrong in shape, their branches reaching in curves I didn't recognize. The familiar headstones looked older, not weathered, older, like they'd been pulled from someplace else entirely and placed there only recently. When I reached the turnoff for row 19, I saw it. The grave, already open. No backhoe nearby. No fresh piles of dirt scattered. Just a neat rectangular cut into the ground. The soil stacked in perfect rows on either side, like it had been scooped out with care and precision not seen in decades. The grass around it was too green for this season. The edges didn't match the rest of the field. It was like someone had drawn it into the earth, not dug it. I parked, engine still running, and just sat there. The paper in my pocket felt heavier now. I didn't want to read it again, but I knew it still only said what it had before. No updates, no corrections. Just deliver before sunrise. I turned off the ignition. The headlights dimmed, but the grave stayed illuminated. It didn't glow. It didn't shimmer. It was just visible, like the ground had decided it deserved to be seen. No one came to meet me. No supervisor, no groundskeeper, no minister or grieving family. And I realized slowly that I wasn't early. I wasn't late. I was the only one expected. I stepped out of the hearse slowly, like the air around me had thickened and was resisting my movement. The cold wasn't sharp, like winter cold. It was dull, old, the kind that seeped through your clothes and into your bones, the kind that didn't sting but settled. I circled to the back of the vehicle and opened the doors. The casket sat in place, perfectly centered, the clamps still tight. But as I reached for the dolly and began to unlock the base, I felt it again. That faint resistance missing. The weight. It wasn't right. After 17 years, your arms know the difference between 130 pounds and nothing at all. There's a certain tension your spine prepares for, a certain lean in your legs. And when I eased the dolly backward and rolled the casket down the ramp, I knew before it even hit the ground. It was too light. Not empty, but not full either. I paused, ran my hand along the side. The metal was colder now, even colder than at the depot. And beneath the surface, I thought I felt something. Not a vibration, not movement exactly, but tension, like the whole thing was wound too tight from the inside. I knelt slightly, tested the weight again with my palms under the base. Too light. Much too light. I'd carried bodies of children heavier than this. My chest tightened. The wind had died completely. Even the trees at the far edge of the cemetery stood still, their branches frozen mid-sway like they'd been caught in the act of something. I looked around again. Still no one. Not a single sign of life. The grave waited behind me. Quiet, unblinking. I turned back to the casket. It wasn't protocol to open a sealed coffin, especially not without identification. But something in me, a part that had survived long nights and frostbitten deliveries and the silence that followed certain transfers, told me I had to look. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I set the dolly lock, released the side latches, and slowly, carefully, unfastened the upper seal. The lid rose smoother than it should have. No suction, no resistance, like the seal had already been broken. I lifted it halfway and paused, heart thudding in my ears. I braced myself for a body, a face, skin pallid with time, maybe some trauma. But what I saw wasn't a person. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. The interior was lined with a coarse fabric, brown, faded, rougher than anything used in standard preparation. No satin, no padding, just raw cloth like burlap. And in the center of that improvised nest lay something wrapped in more of the same. Layers of it, tied with what looked like cord or sinew, the knots old, precise, pulled tight in ways I didn't recognize. It wasn't a body, not in the way we understand them. It was a form, human-shaped, but smaller, incomplete. The limbs had no length, the head, no structure. It was as if whoever or whatever had been inside had been erased down to suggestion. I leaned closer, mouth dry, and saw a small object resting atop the chest, or where a chest should have been. A pendant, circular, no chain, just placed there, intentionally. The metal was dark, but smooth, almost glassy, and covered in tiny etchings that didn't look like letters or symbols I'd ever seen. Not Latin, not Hebrew, nothing from any chapel I'd driven to. It pulsed faintly under the light, not glowing, not warm, but the way it caught the air made me think it didn't belong to this place, or this time. I didn't touch it. I should have closed the casket right then, should have sealed it, rolled it to the grave, and walked away. But my legs wouldn't move. My breath wouldn't return. I felt a pressure in the back of my throat, a presence just behind my eyes like I was about to cry. But I wasn't sad. It wasn't grief. It was recognition, and I had no reason to feel it. That's when I heard the sound. Not close, not loud, but unmistakable. A voice, muffled, soft, like something speaking from the bottom of a well. It didn't form words. It wasn't language, just rhythm, like breath against stone. It came from somewhere ahead, toward the rows of headstones. I turned, slowly, and saw no one. The cemetery was still empty, but the grave was different now. The soil no longer looked freshly dug. It looked old, settled, as if the opening had been waiting longer than the grass around it. As if the earth remembered something being taken out, not placed in. The pendant in the casket flickered once, almost imperceptibly, like it reacted to the shift in attention. I backed away slowly and lowered the lid. I couldn't seal it. Not again. My hands wouldn't do it. They shook too much. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally moved, it was only to sit on the edge of the hearse, staring at the casket, and realizing, truly realizing for the first time in my career, I had delivered something that didn't have a name. And maybe never did. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I told myself I had done the job. That whatever was in that casket, however wrong it had felt in my arms and under my skin, it had been delivered. That's what mattered. That's what I was paid for. But all through the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had remained with me. Not a smell, not a sound. Something more like a weight that settled behind the ribs and didn't move. I washed my hands 3 times before bed. I checked the back of the hearse twice, even though I knew it was empty. And when I finally lay down, it was like sleep circled the room without ever touching me. My eyes closed, but I didn't rest. I saw the casket, the pendant, the hollow shape wrapped in burlap. I saw the open grave that looked like it had never been dug, only remembered. By morning, I had already made my decision. I needed to see it again. Not the body, no, never again that, but the grave, the plot. I needed to be sure that I had left it there, that it had stayed buried. I didn't tell the office, didn't log the visit. I just got in my car, not the hearse. I couldn't sit in that seat again, and drove the same route I always did. But this time, it was different in ways I couldn't name. The streets looked too clean, the lights too still. I didn't pass a single car. It was as if the city had been paused, and I was the only one still walking through it. When I reached Pine Hill, I half expected the gate to be closed again, or rusted shut, or gone entirely. But it was open, wider than the night before, welcoming, as if the cemetery knew I would return. The morning light was gray, flat, without temperature. The gravel crunched under my tires like old bones. I parked and walked the rest of the way. Row 19, plot 3. I didn't need to check the instructions again. My feet knew where to go before I told them. The grass was damp, the earth soft, but my boots left no marks. As I approached the plot, I froze. There was a headstone. It hadn't been there the night before. Of that I was certain. The ground had been open. The grave had been waiting. But now, there it stood. A granite slab, newly placed. The soil around it still pressed from recent settling. No flowers, no offerings, just the stone. I moved closer. That's when I saw the name. It took a moment to register. At first, the letters blurred like heat waves on hot asphalt, unreadable even though they were etched in clean, fresh lines. Then it cleared, and I saw it. My name. First, middle, last. Exactly as it appears on my license. The same way it was written on the forms I filled out when I took this job 17 years ago. Below it, a date of birth. My date of birth. And below that, a date of death. It was yesterday, the day I made the delivery. My knees weakened. I reached out to steady myself on the top of the stone, but my fingers didn't feel the granite. I looked down. My hand was touching it, I could see that. But I felt nothing. No texture. No resistance. Just cold, like touching the idea of stone, not the stone itself. I turned and stumbled back toward the gatehouse. It was open now. Lights on. Radio playing something low and crackling, like a church broadcast through a bad speaker. I stepped inside, expecting to see someone behind the counter. There was. A man I didn't recognize. Young, clean uniform. A tag that read, Foreman. I asked him, breathless, desperate, about the headstone on row 19, plot 3. Told him there must be some mistake. Told him the name on the grave was mine. That I'd delivered a body there last night and now someone had put my name where it didn't belong. He stared at me a moment too long. Then calmly, He turned to the ledger on the desk and flipped to the page for that section. He ran a finger down the lines, stopped, and turned the book so I could see. There it was. My name. Burial date, yesterday. Gravedigger, blank. Driver, me. Signature, mine. I didn't remember signing anything. I didn't remember walking into the office, and yet the handwriting was unmistakable. I'd filled out that line. Somehow. I looked up at him again, but his face had changed. Not in expression, still calm, still polite, but in detail. His eyes were too still, his skin too smooth, like a mannequin wearing the shape of a man I might trust. He said nothing. I stepped back, out of the room, out into the morning that no longer felt like morning. And as I walked to my car, I realized something that hollowed me from the inside out. No one had spoken my name all morning, not once. The next few days passed like a blur that never stopped to ask if I was still part of it. I didn't call the office. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't even eat for almost 2 days. The food sat in the fridge untouched, like it wasn't meant for me anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gravestone. My name, carved in stone I couldn't feel. My signature on a page I never remembered writing. It wasn't just unsettling. It was like someone had written the end of my life in ink I hadn't noticed until it dried. But I told myself I could still pull away from it, that it was a mistake, a glitch, some unholy joke played by the system, or my mind, or both. All I had to do was return to normal, prove to myself that I still had control over the wheel, over the routes, over the job. So I tried. I got up before dawn, put on the same uniform I had worn for 17 years, pressed the shirt, polished the shoes, walked out into the garage and looked at the hearse sitting there. It looked the same. A little dusty, but otherwise untouched. I climbed into the driver's seat. Familiar, cold leather. The way the steering wheel always stuck a little to the right. I inserted the key. It turned, and the GPS lit up. Automatically. No prompts, no login screen. Just one destination, already loaded. Pine Hill Cemetery. I hadn't touched anything. My hand hovered over the dashboard like I could erase the coordinates just by willing it, but it didn't work. I tried to clear the route. It stayed. I turned the key back. The engine died. Then I tried again. New key, clean ignition, same result. Pine Hill. Always Pine Hill. It became a pattern. Every morning, the route was there. Sometimes it would flash on the screen before I even turned the engine on, like the hearse already knew where to go before I decided to leave the house. Then the noises started. At first I thought it was just the garage shifting, metal groaning. But no, it was specific, deliberate. From the back compartment, a creaking like hinges testing themselves in the dark. One night I opened the doors. Nothing there. But the next morning, the handle to the rear latch had a faint smear on it. A black mark, like dried ash. I didn't touch it again. The days became hollow. The calls from the funeral home stopped. The phone still worked. I checked it compulsively, but no one called me anymore. Not my supervisor, not the dispatchers, not even my daughter. I sent her 3 messages. All were marked delivered, but none read. I drove to her house once, knocked, waited. Her car was there, lights on, but no one opened the door. I saw a curtain move, and then nothing. I started sleeping in the driver's seat. I don't remember deciding that. It just felt like the only place where the sounds made sense. The house felt too far away, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I kept the hearse parked under the old elm behind the garage. Every night the noises came closer. I stopped checking. I didn't want to see what might be sitting there behind the divider. Then one night I got out. I walked to the back, and I found it. Another delivery form. Typed. No sender. It was tucked into the edge of the divider like someone had slid it through from the inside. I unfolded it with shaking hands. No name. No ID. Destination. Pine Hill Cemetery. Date. Tonight. Driver. Me. Body. Undisclosed. There was a line for a signature at the bottom. Mine was already there. Perfectly written. I sat down on the gravel and waited for something to explain it. A voice. A shadow. A lie. Anything. But the world was silent. The trees didn't move. The stars didn't blink. The moon above looked more like a lid closing. The next morning, I got into the hearse. The GPS turned on by itself. Same route, same time. The garage door opened before I touched the switch. I drove. I didn't stop. Not when the road narrowed into a path I didn't recognize. Not when the trees grew denser and darker. Not when I realized I hadn't passed a single other vehicle for over an hour. The map said I was close. Then I saw the gate. Pine Hill, but different. Older. Rotting. Open. The air smelled like old flowers and closed drawers. And there it was. A grave already open. The same row. Same plot. But this time, the name was already carved. My name. Again. I turned off the ignition. The hearse stayed on. I opened the door. The lights didn't change. The back of the hearse creaked slowly, and I didn't need to look. I stepped out, walked toward the open grave. No one was there. No gravedigger, no priest, no mourner. But I heard something behind me. The hearse door closing by itself. When I turned, the headlights were off. The engine silent, and I wasn't holding the keys anymore. The final thing I remember before climbing down into the grave wasn't fear. It was a strange, unbearable sense of recognition. Like I had done this before. Like I was only finishing a job I had started, long ago. And somewhere in the hearse behind me, another delivery form waited to be signed. Story 4. I was 43 the first time I saw her. I remember the exact smell of the hallway, antiseptic and boiled coffee, and the way the flickering light above the morgue door buzzed as if trying to warn me. I'd been working as a funeral transport driver for over 15 years by then, and that hospital in upstate Pennsylvania wasn't new to me. It was just another job, another cold corridor at 2 in the morning. The staff had already prepped the body, and I was walking toward the double doors of the basement morgue with my clipboard in one hand and my thermos in the other. Then I saw her, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, pale skin, dark hair so black it swallowed the weak light around her, and a plain black dress like something you'd see on a porcelain doll in an antique shop. She stood motionless just outside the morgue door, hands by her side, eyes not blinking. I paused mid-step. For a second, I assumed she was someone's daughter. Maybe a night nurse had brought her along, some emergency no sitter could prevent. But there was no movement, no sound, no sign that she even acknowledged me. Just that stare. I looked around, expecting to see a frantic adult chasing after her, but the hallway was empty. Still, it wasn't my business. I was tired, and the job was the job. I gave her a nod, as if to say, "It's okay, kid," and pushed through the swinging doors. When I came back out with the gurney, she was gone. Hospitals are strange places at night. You hear things. Vents rattling, elevators groaning, machines humming like distant voices. So I filed it away as just another oddity and moved on. But then I saw her again. 2 weeks later, in a different state entirely, this time in a hospice center outside of Baltimore. She was standing beside the loading dock behind the building, where no child should have been. Same dress, same empty stare, same silence. I didn't even bother to approach. I finished the paperwork and left quickly, more annoyed than anything else. A year passed before I saw her again. By then, I'd told myself it must have been my mind playing tricks. Working in the death trade does things to your brain, makes you see the weight behind every door and imagine hands reaching from body bags. But there she was again, in Ohio this time, near a home for the terminally ill. Always on nights when I transported someone without family. Always alone. Always outside, never speaking, never approaching. By the 5th time I had started bracing for her. I'd catch myself looking for her the moment I pulled into a driveway. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of resigned curiosity, like checking for a shadow that had begun to feel familiar. She was never on any roster, never in the building, and no nurse or orderly ever mentioned a girl nearby. Once, I asked, casually, about a child wandering the back hallway. The nurse blinked at me like I'd grown horns. "There are no children here, sir," she said, her tone clipped, almost defensive. I didn't push it. After all, who would believe a man who claims a ghost child is haunting his roots? But she kept showing up. Every few months, sometimes more often, but only at jobs involving bodies with no family, no next of kin, no flowers. Just me, the van, the silence, and her. The girl was always there before I arrived, never after, and she always vanished by the time the loading doors closed. One night in Minnesota, I paused before pulling away from the facility, headlights cutting across the edge of the parking lot. I saw her again, standing just outside the beam of light, dress barely fluttering in the breeze. She didn't blink. She didn't move. I put the van in drive and left the lot, but I looked in the rearview mirror for miles after that, half expecting her to be sitting in the back with the casket. There was something about the way she watched. Not mournful, not lost. It was like she was checking something off, like she was waiting for someone, not the dead, but maybe someone who thought he was still alive. That was the first time I truly wondered if the girl was there for them or for me. It took me longer than I care to admit to notice the pattern. At first, she was just a strange recurrence, a spectral child lingering in the periphery of my work. But patterns emerge when you've been doing the same job for 30 years, and I started noticing that she was never around when the dead had people waiting. Not once. If there were flowers, families, or prayers, she wasn't there. But when the call came in for a John or Jane Doe, no family to claim them, no next of kin, nothing but a date and a destination, I'd see her again. A glimpse through a chain-link fence, a flash in a rear alley, standing at the end of a hallway where no child should be, always wearing that same black dress, always with her arms still and eyes fixed on the loading area, like she was waiting for confirmation that the body had been taken. I remember one particular call from a city facility near Detroit. It was a rain-slick night in early spring, and the hospital staff was running skeleton crew due to budget cuts. The man I was there to collect had died from exposure, a homeless veteran with no ID. All they gave me was a handwritten slip with the word unidentified and a time of death. I just finished securing the gurney in the back when I glanced toward the dumpster enclosure behind the building. There she was, again, standing like a sentry, still, watching. The floodlight behind her flickered. For a split second I thought I saw her blink, but I couldn't be sure. That night I finally asked. There was a nurse on duty, young and half asleep, but polite enough. I leaned in and said, "Hey, do you guys have a grief counselor or someone bringing their kid around during night shifts? There's this little girl I keep seeing." She looked confused. "What little girl?" I pointed through the small window toward the rear lot. Nothing. The nurse gave me a careful look, the kind you reserve for someone who might need help. There are no children in this building. Haven't been since we closed the pediatric wing years ago. I thanked her, brushed it off, and walked out pretending it was nothing. But my hands were trembling. A week later, I tried again. Different state, different facility. I made casual conversation with an old coworker, Ron, who'd been in the business nearly as long as me. We were unloading a body into cold storage when I asked if he'd ever seen anything weird on these pickups, like a girl hanging around. Ron just frowned. "You mean family members?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, a little girl. Dark hair, black dress, just around, always when it's someone with no family." He gave me a slow look, then said, "You okay, man?" That's when I realized he hadn't seen her. Not once, even though she had been there just that morning, standing right behind the fence at the edge of the lot, no more than 20 feet away. That was the first time I wondered if maybe she wasn't there for everyone. Maybe she was only visible to people like me, people who'd seen too much, who'd carried too many souls into the ground. Maybe she was part of the job, or maybe she was the part of the job no one talks about. I started checking the records. Every time I got a body with no documentation, I'd skim the forms, the digital logbooks, any scrap of paperwork. But her name never appeared, not even once. Not under survivors, not as next of kin, not even as a witness or visitor. I asked dispatch once, half-jokingly, if they ever had any callers mention a girl showing up at job sites. They just laughed and told me I needed a vacation. It wasn't until I started writing down the dates that it became undeniable. Every sighting, every transfer. I made a list in the back of one of my old mileage logs. Over the years, the names of the dead faded in my memory, but her presence remained sharp. Each entry with no family, no belongings, no backstory, just a name or number on a toe tag, and I'd seen her. Once in Oklahoma, I pulled into a rundown hospice to pick up a woman in her 80s who had passed during the night. No family, no funeral home arrangements, no belongings. Just a nurse who handed me the clipboard and said, "It's a mercy someone came." When I opened the van to place the gurney, I saw her, inside the vehicle, just for a second, sitting silently in the back seat. But when I blinked, she was gone. The passenger door hadn't even opened. The windows were fogged from the cold. That was when something in me changed. I stopped trying to explain it. I stopped asking questions, because deep down, I already knew the answer. The girl wasn't real, not in the way the world defines real. She wasn't on any list because she wasn't meant to be. She was something else, an echo, a reminder, a shadow that only touched the forgotten. But what I didn't understand yet was why she kept following me, and why she was getting closer. I remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong with how close she was getting. It wasn't just the glances from a distance anymore. It wasn't shadows in rearview mirrors or half-seen figures by the crematory fence. This time, she was there, in the same room, sharing the same air, no longer observing, but present, tangible. That night had started like any other, a standard service. Evening viewing at a small chapel near the state line. Someone I didn't know, a name I recognized only because it belonged to a former co-worker, Curtis Maynard. He disappeared from the industry a decade ago. Rumors said he quit after a breakdown. Others claimed he died alone in a county facility. I hadn't thought of him in years, yet there he was, his name printed on the silver frame of a cheap plastic stand next to a closed casket. No photo, no flowers, just the name and silence. I was there to assist with the transfer once the wake ended. The room was dim and heavy with stale air. The few attendants present were scattered like shadows along the pews, none of them familiar, all of them still. It took me a full minute before I saw her. Last row, left side, sitting completely upright, hands folded in her lap. Black dress, black shoes, dark bangs just above her eyes. The same girl, except this time, she wasn't at the edge of the parking lot. She wasn't behind glass or outside in the cold. She was in the chapel, and she was looking directly at me. I froze. My breath caught somewhere between my ribs and my throat, and I had to grip the back of a pew to steady myself. For the first time in years of seeing her, she acknowledged me. A small tilt of the head, then that smile, thin, lifeless. Not the smile of a child, but of something wearing a child's face. The corners of her mouth moved, but her eyes, those dark, bottomless eyes, remained unchanged, hollow. I turned away, pretending I had something to check on the paperwork, but my hands were trembling. When I looked up again, she was gone. I moved toward the casket, now desperate to finish the job and leave. But something was wrong. The nameplate on the casket had changed. No longer Curtis Maynard, just a blank slot, empty. No engraving, no memory. I looked around the room. The mourners were gone. All of them. Not a sound, not a step, not even the creak of a door. I rushed to the hallway, certain I'd lost track of time. But the funeral director's desk was abandoned, the lights dimmed to closing mode. It felt as if someone had hit pause on reality itself, and I was the only thing still moving inside a photograph that no longer made sense. I went back to the chapel, determined to confirm at least something was still as it should be. But when I approached the casket again, I felt an unfamiliar cold. Not the temperature of death I was used to, but something older, empty, a hollowness that sank into my chest like inhaling smoke. I gripped the handles and cracked the lid open. It wasn't heavy, too light, and when I looked inside, it was empty. No Curtis, no body, no satin pillow or embalmer's tags, just the echo of a whisper that might have come from under the floorboards, or my own head. I don't remember closing the lid again. I only remember backing away slowly, not taking my eyes off the casket, expecting her to be inside now, curled up where he should have been. Instead, I turned to leave. But at the chapel door, something stopped me. On the wall, next to the exit, was a mirror I had passed countless times during funerals in that building. I'd seen it often, always reflected the dim amber light of the ceiling fixtures and the quiet corridor behind. But this time, my reflection wasn't there. The hallway showed up clear, the lights, the door, even the outline of the casket behind me. But I wasn't in it. I waved my hand slowly in front of the glass. Nothing. The glass stayed still, undisturbed, showing only the room I had once been part of, and now, apparently wasn't. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just walked out, got in the van, locked the doors, Drove away with the back still empty and my heart beating like a drum caught in fog. All the way home, the rearview mirror remained adjusted down toward the last bench seat, even though I hadn't touched it, even though I knew I wouldn't see myself there. But I expected, feared, even hoped to see her, because somehow that would have meant I was still real. It had been a few days since the chapel incident, but I hadn't spoken to anyone about it. Not the staff, not the dispatcher, not even my supervisor. I told myself it was just stress, fatigue, an accumulation of too many years spent staring at caskets and carrying the silence of other people's grief. That's what I told myself as I accepted another overnight run, this time to a rural cemetery on the outskirts of Glenmore County. A simple transfer. Pick up from a hospice, drive the remains out to a cremation facility where the family would be waiting in the morning. No ceremony, no viewing, just a drive through the woods and 2 signatures. I welcomed the solitude, or thought I did. The pickup was uneventful. The body was bagged and sealed, and the attendant on duty barely spoke a word, just nodded, signed the release form, and returned to her desk. The hallway outside the storage unit was dim, and I could feel that old, familiar weight on my shoulders again. Not the casket, something else, like static in the air, like the hum of something ancient and watching. Still, I loaded the stretcher into the back of the van and closed the doors without a sound. It was nearly midnight by the time I turned onto the main road out of town. The highway was long and empty, no other cars for miles, just pine trees pressing in from both sides, and the low growl of the engine beneath the creaking of the old suspension. I turned the radio on to break the silence, but all I got was static. Switched stations. Nothing. Just a thin, whining frequency that felt like it was burrowing into my ears. I turned it off. Maybe 30 minutes out, I felt something. Not saw. Felt. A shift in pressure. Like the van got heavier. The springs sagged ever so slightly, just enough for me to notice. I checked the side mirror. Nothing but black trees. I glanced at the rear view, expecting to see the edge of the stretcher, maybe one of the straps loose. But what I saw wasn't the body. It was a small shape, sitting upright on the left side bench. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Maybe the shadows had formed into something that resembled her. But then the figure moved, turned its head slightly. I couldn't make out the face in the dark, but I knew it was her, the child, the same one from the hospital, from the chapel, from every corner of my memory where she had no right to be. I pulled the van over so hard it skidded onto the gravel shoulder, kicking up dust. I cut the engine and just sat there for a second, breathing, telling myself over and over to be rational, to just check, to prove to myself that it was nothing. But when I turned around to face the back of the vehicle, the door on the passenger side was slightly open. I hadn't opened it. I got out, walked around, hands shaking as I reached for the latch. I pulled it slowly, half expecting the night itself to scream at me. But there was no sound. Just her. She was seated exactly where I'd seen her, feet dangling above the floor, hands folded neatly in her lap like a passenger waiting for the ride to continue. Her eyes were locked forward. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't even seem surprised to see me staring at her. I tried to speak, but my throat closed. Nothing came out. I stepped closer, one foot into the van, the other still on the dirt road. The interior smelled strange, like cold flowers and old leather. I reached out, slowly, to touch her shoulder, just to see if she was real. But the moment my fingers brushed the fabric of her dress, she vanished. Not fled, not ducked. She simply wasn't there anymore. But the seat was still warm, and the rearview mirror was tilted down, aimed directly at the bench where she'd been. I don't adjust my mirrors downward. Never have. The floor had faint marks, small prints in the layer of dust. Bare feet. She'd been there. I sat in the driver's seat, heart racing, palms damp, and tried to think. The body was still secured in the back. The doors were shut now. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal. The air had changed. The woods were quieter than they should have been, like the trees were holding their breath. I turned the engine back on and drove, faster than before, barely stopping when I reached the crematorium. I didn't say a word during the handoff, just signed where I needed to, nodded at the technician, and got back in the van. But I didn't head home, not right away. I pulled over a few miles down the road and sat there, staring at the dashboard, hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to the world. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about her, the way she looked right ahead, the calmness of her posture, like she'd always belonged there, like I was the one intruding in her domain. I used to think I understood death, that after all these years, I had grown numb to the weight of it. But after that night, I realized I hadn't been numb. I'd been naive. Because sometimes, death isn't what we bury. Sometimes it's what rides with us. And sometimes, it's what watches from the back seat. A week passed, maybe more. I stopped keeping track of time after a while. Sleep came in fragments. I'd wake up sweating with the image of that rear-view mirror burned into my mind. I tried driving other routes, shorter ones, day shifts, even taking a brief leave under the pretense of exhaustion. But nothing dulled the memory. The silence in the back seat had taken on a new weight, one I couldn't reason through. Something had changed in me. Or maybe something had been waiting, and now it finally had my attention. Then the envelope arrived. No postage, no name, just left under the windshield wiper of my car, right outside the funeral home. Pale yellow paper, folded clean, sealed with a brittle strip of tape. I almost threw it away, assuming it was some misplaced flyer or maybe a passive-aggressive note from someone upset I parked too close. But there was something about the way my name was typed on the front, just Thomas, that made me pause. No last name, no formality, just recognition. I took it inside, waited until I was alone in the break room, and peeled it open. Inside was a single sheet of aged paper, typewritten. The ink had that faint blur that suggested age but not carelessness. It hadn't been photocopied. This had been prepared, on purpose, line by line. At the top, centered, it simply read, "Transfer log, 2005 to present." Beneath that, a list. A long one. Names I recognized. Names I had personally delivered. Most were John Does, Jane Does. Unidentified remains from road accidents or forgotten wards from long-term care homes. I kept scanning downward, each line listing the name, date, and location of pickup. But beside each name was something I'd never seen in any official documentation. A column on the far right, labeled "Accompanied," typed in red. Next to over a dozen of the names was a single word, repeated again and again. Child. No name, no ID, no notes. Just that one word. Sometimes twice on the same line, sometimes spaced years apart, but always tied to a transfer I had handled. All of them ones I remembered clearly. The quiet ones, the unclaimed ones, the ones where no family ever came to collect the ashes. I reached the bottom of the page, and that's when I felt my stomach twist. There was one final entry, with no date, just blank lines across the columns, except one. Name, Thomas. Vehicle, 949. Location of departure, St. Elma Regional Hospital. Accompanied, child. I dropped the page like it burned. St. Elma was where I'd first seen her. That forgotten hallway, that chipped linoleum tile outside the morgue. That was over a decade ago. I hadn't thought about the name of the hospital in years, and yet there it was, as fresh on the page as if someone had typed it yesterday. My hands were shaking. I lifted the sheet again, hoping I'd misread something. But no. My name, my van, my beginning, and maybe my end. That night, I sat in the van long after my shift ended. I didn't want to go home. I didn't know what I would find there. I stared at the ignition, then at the mirror. It was angled slightly down again, even though I had fixed it that morning. I stared into it for a long time, expecting, no, fearing to see her face there, hovering in the darkness behind me. She wasn't there, but the passenger door slowly unlocked itself with a click. No one opened it. It didn't swing wide, just unlatched. A silent invitation, or a warning. I got out, left the van running in the parking lot, walked home without looking back. The next morning, the vehicle was parked neatly in my driveway. The key was still in my coat pocket, and on the dashboard was another envelope. I haven't opened it yet, but I already know what's inside. I think she's waiting for me to be ready, and when I am, I'll see that final entry again, with the date filled in, and the child finally listed by name. Story 5. I had been behind the wheel of a hearse for nearly 30 years. I'd seen everything from grief-stricken families clinging to the casket to entire funerals where not a single mourner showed up. I knew the weight of silence, the texture of mourning, the way death made time bend slightly out of rhythm. So when the call came in late that Thursday night, I didn't flinch. The dispatcher's voice was unfamiliar, younger, flatter, like someone reciting from a script. But the number on the screen matched the agency's main line. Pickup needed. Body is prepped. Destination already programmed into the vehicle. Urgent delivery. That was all they gave me. No name, no case number, just the job. Normally I would have pushed back, but something in the tone made me reach for the keys and head out. When I arrived at the hospital loading dock, the back gate was already unlocked, and a lone orderly, one I'd never seen before, stood beside a sealed casket with a clipboard that held only one item, a printed instruction in bold font. Avoid unnecessary stops. No signature, no origin, no release form, just that. The orderly didn't speak. He simply nodded toward the hearse and helped me load the casket into the compartment like it was any other night. But the moment I turned the ignition, I noticed something off. The GPS lit up on its own. The screen flickered once, then settled on a single glowing arrow. No estimated arrival time, no distance, no street names, just the arrow, gently pulsing like a heartbeat, pointing forward into the night. The first 10 minutes of the drive were uneventful, if eerily quiet. I took the familiar route westward, toward the only cemetery still receiving bodies at that hour. The radio refused to turn on. My phone had no signal. Even the low hum of the engine felt thinner than usual, as if the vehicle was unsure of its own motion. Every so often, I glanced back at the casket through the rearview mirror. It was sealed shut, secured as always, but something about it made my spine stiffen. There was a tension in the air, not the emotional kind, but something heavier, metallic, like static before a lightning strike. At the first intersection, I noticed the street sign was missing. Not vandalized, just gone. The pole stood clean and empty. I drove on. The next stoplight flickered red, then green, then red again, stuttering like a broken signal. Still, I followed the GPS arrow. I told myself it was a glitch, a minor technical hiccup. These things happened, but deep down I knew better. I'd worked this route hundreds of times. I knew its rhythm, its turns, its quiet landmarks, and something, whatever was behind me in that casket, had disrupted the pattern. A mile later, the road curved in a way it never had before. I passed a corner store that I was sure had burned down years ago. The burned husk I remembered was now lit and stocked, open for business, but no one was inside. No clerk, no customers, just flickering fluorescent lights and shelves lined with dustless goods. I kept driving. I told myself not to look in the mirror again, but of course I did. The casket hadn't moved, but the air felt heavier now. I could almost feel it pressing against the back of my neck, like breath from a mouth I couldn't hear. By the time I realized the GPS still hadn't changed, I'd already passed the same gas station 3 times. Same flickering sign, same broken pump. I made a sharp right, then another. A shortcut I'd taken before, but it brought me right back to the same intersection, and the same silent, waiting direction on the screen. The body in the back had no name, no history, and now, apparently, no destination. I gripped the wheel tighter, told myself it was exhaustion, that I'd taken on too much, that the weirdness of the night was just a trick of the mind. But I'd never been one to believe in that kind of thing. Not until that night. Not until I realized the road itself was starting to forget where it led. I'd taken detours before. Accidents, storms, even police blockades had forced me down unfamiliar streets in the past, but I always knew how to find my way back. That's part of the job. Navigating grief through neighborhoods, getting the departed where they need to go, without getting lost yourself. But this time was different. Every time I turned, the map changed. The screen of the GPS didn't just recalculate. It seemed to erase and redraw roads in real time. Streets that had existed for decades were now blank gray lines. Some had names I'd never seen before, in strange, archaic fonts that didn't match the system. And every time I tried to override the route manually, the device blinked, then reset itself, returning to the same arrow, glowing faintly, always pointing straight ahead. I drove past the same boarded-up diner twice more, its windows cracked in identical places, the same neon open sign buzzing, though I knew it had closed in the 90s. The billboard across the road, once promoting car insurance, now advertised nothing, just a plain black background with the words, "Your turn," in weathered white paint. That's when I started to feel the cold. Not in the air, but in my chest, like something was settling there, watching through my ribs. I turned onto what should have been Elm Street, but it wasn't Elm Street. It was a narrow, tree-covered passage I didn't recognize. No streetlights, no houses, just a winding road where the shadows between the trees seemed thicker than they should have been. The headlights barely pierced the dark. It was like the road itself didn't want to be seen. I drove slower, leaning forward in my seat. That's when the static began. First in the speakers, a low, crackling hum, then in the mirrors. The rear view began to blur, as though heat waves were rising off the casket, distorting everything behind me. But the air was cold, and completely still. Then I saw the church. It shouldn't have been there. It stood at a curve where nothing had ever stood before. A small white building with a pointed steeple and no windows. Just a black door. The GPS glitched again, then showed a new label above the arrow. Recalculate to origin. I pulled over. Not because I wanted to, but because my hands did it on their own. I stared at the church. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, but something in the back of my mind, maybe instinct, maybe something else, whispered not to move. I reached for my phone again. No signal, no time. The screen simply read, tracking. I turned off the engine. Everything went silent. The church door opened. I didn't see anyone come out. There was no movement, no sound. Just an open door and a dark interior that seemed to stretch farther than the building's size could allow. I blinked, and it was gone. The church, the curve, the trees, all gone. I was back on the main road, or at least something that resembled it. But the mileage counter had reset to 0. The GPS displayed a single word, proceed. I started the engine again, but the ignition lagged, like it didn't want to wake. As the hearse rumbled back to life, I looked in the mirror and saw condensation creeping across the glass again. The casket hadn't moved, but the straps holding it in place were loose, not broken, not torn, just unlatched. As I pulled back onto the road, I noticed the street signs had changed, not vandalized, replaced. One read Sable Crossing, another Ash Hollow. These weren't names from this region. They weren't names from anywhere I knew. The arrow on the GPS continued to pulse, but I no longer knew if it pointed to any real place. All I knew was I hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour, and every time I thought I recognized a landmark, I'd pass it again a few minutes later, altered, wrong, like a dream trying to remember itself. The road wasn't taking me anywhere. It was taking me in. The road ahead was barely illuminated, the beams from the headlights stretching no more than 10 feet before melting into the fog that had begun to seep in from the trees. I slowed the hearse to a crawl, the engine whining in protest, and then, without a warning sound, without a flicker or a surge, everything shut off. The headlights, the dashboard, the GPS. Even the low hum of the engine stopped like someone had unplugged the world. I sat in perfect stillness, gripping the wheel as my breath echoed inside the cabin like I'd been thrown into a sealed chamber. The only light came from the faint green glow of the GPS screen as it rebooted itself. But instead of a map, it displayed a single word in block letters across the center. Return. Not reroute. Not destination changed. Just that. Return. I opened the door, my legs unsure under me, and stepped out into a silence so thick it felt alive. There was no wind, no insects, not even the distant hiss of electricity from nearby poles, because there weren't any. Just the whisper of gravel beneath my boots, and the faint sound of condensation ticking down the hearse's side panels like slow rain. I circled to the back. The air felt denser the closer I got to the rear doors. I don't know what I expected. Maybe to find nothing, maybe to find everything, but my fingers hesitated above the latch like they were waiting for permission, and then I heard it. A sound so subtle I thought it might be in my head. A soft, rhythmic pressure, not tapping, not knocking, but breathing, shallow, labored, coming from inside the casket. My hand pulled back. Instinct screamed at me to get in the car and drive. But where? The roads didn't lead anywhere. They bent reality like wet wire, twisting back on themselves. I opened the back doors, slowly. As the panels swung open, a chill escaped like breath from a freezer. The casket was still sealed, but the window above it, one of the small panes designed for families to peek in during open transport, was fogged from the inside. And worse, there were faint smears against the glass, as if fingers had dragged along it. 5 of them. I called out, not to anyone, just to the silence. My voice cracked on the second syllable and died in the third. No echo, no response. I stepped away and turned my eyes toward the sky, but even the stars had vanished. The moon was there, and not. It shimmered like it was seen through moving water. A ripple of something passed through me. Not wind, something inside, something trying to adjust. I slammed the doors shut, fastened the lock, climbed back into the cab, and turned the key. The hearse sputtered, coughed, and finally wheezed back to life like an old man taking his last breath. The GPS showed the map again, but the destination dot had shifted. It no longer pointed to the cemetery I'd been heading for. It marked a new location, one I didn't recognize. No road name, no city, just a single phrase written in that same pale green glow. Place of rest. I put the car in gear. My foot didn't press the pedal. It moved on its own, as if it was responding to something older than logic. As I eased back onto the road, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The time on the dash. It had returned, but it hadn't moved. It was frozen at the exact minute I'd left the hospital loading dock. 2:44 a.m., and no matter how long I drove, it stayed the same. Then came the real silence, the kind that presses on your teeth, the kind you hear with your bones. That's when I realized I was no longer driving through a world that knew me. I was in some mirrored version, some recursive trap laid out not in asphalt and dirt, but in intention. The casket behind me, it wasn't trying to get home. It was trying to make me forget I ever had one. The GPS held its green glow like a phosphorescent wound in the dark, blinking steadily as the hearse rolled through a tunnel of trees that didn't appear on any map I knew. The branches above me curved unnaturally, like ribs closing around a path that wasn't meant to exist. The air grew heavier with every mile, the kind of weight that sits in your lungs and turns your breath shallow. Then, just as suddenly as the road had twisted into something unfamiliar, I saw the gates, black iron, tall as any building, looming out of the mist like they had been there for centuries. But this wasn't the cemetery I was assigned to. It was older, cracked, covered in vines and moss. And yet the GPS insisted, "You have arrived." The problem was, the gates were shut. Not locked, just closed, like a mouth refusing to speak. I got out and walked toward them, my boots silent on the dirt road. No wind, no owls, no insects. The fog hung low, not moving, not rising, like it was waiting. The guard booth by the entrance was lit from within, but completely empty. A mug sat on the desk, still steaming. A chair leaned slightly, like someone had just stood up and walked away. But there were no footsteps, no doors ajar, only the faint, sour smell of rotting flowers. I rang the service bell once. It didn't echo, just died. I rang again. Nothing. I picked up the old rotary phone inside the booth, the one connected to the groundskeeper's cabin. No dial tone. The second hand on the wall clock was stuck between 2 ticks. I checked my own watch. Still 2:44 a.m. Hadn't moved. Not once. I returned to the hearse. The fog was beginning to creep across the windshield like frost, threading over the glass in long veins. I checked the back. The casket hadn't shifted, but the condensation inside the viewing window was gone now. Instead, a small circle had been cleared, as if someone inside had wiped it away. To look out. I stepped back and slammed the doors shut again, harder than before, expecting, maybe hoping, for a reaction. None came. The gates, though, were open now. Silently, without sound or motion, they stood wide as if they'd never been closed. I never saw them move, but there they were. I drove forward slowly, tires crunching over gravel that sounded too loud in the stillness. The cemetery stretched before me, familiar in layout, but not in atmosphere. The street lamps that usually lit the main road were off. The chapel lights, always left glowing by the night staff, were dark. Every headstone I passed looked the same. No names, just blank gray slabs lined in endless rows like placeholders waiting for something not yet dead. The designated plot was easy to find. It was the only one dug. The soil beside it was wet and slumped as if it had been opened and closed many times before. I stopped the car, waited. Nothing moved. I opened the back of the hearse. The casket was on its side again. Not rolled, not jostled. Turned, facing the opposite direction. Its latches were still sealed, but one hinge looked looser than it had when I left the hospital. I decided not to open it. Instead, I stepped around to the passenger door and reached for the dispatch folder. It was gone. All the paperwork, the manifest, the chain of custody, even the rubber-banded ID tags. The only thing in the folder now was a single sheet of paper, blank, except for one handwritten line, right at the bottom. Incomplete delivery will not be accepted. I should have left then. I should have closed the doors, reversed the car, driven into the trees until the gas ran out. But I couldn't. My hands moved on their own, sliding the back ramp down, unlocking the latch, gripping the handles. The casket felt heavier this time, much heavier, like something inside had changed density, or like someone else had joined it. When I reached the open grave, the mist cleared for just a moment, long enough to see the headstone. My name was on it. No dates, no epitaph, just the name. I turned back to the hearse, but it was gone, not driven away, not stolen, simply no longer there. The gravel was untouched, no tracks, no dust, no scent of gasoline or oil, just emptiness, and behind it, the fog, waiting. I stood alone in the cemetery, my name etched in stone behind me, and not a single sound dared break the silence. Not the birds, not the wind, not even the insects that usually filled the night with their aimless humming. Just fog, just gravestones, just the echo of something I hadn't fully accepted yet. The hearse had vanished, and with it, every anchor to the world I thought I knew. I walked, half expecting the ground to give beneath my feet, but it didn't. The path still held. The gates were still open behind me, exactly as I'd left them, waiting like a mouth waiting to swallow me again. I followed the same road I'd driven in, the same cracked gravel, the same curve around the angel statue missing half its face. It should have taken me out onto County Route 17, straight toward the next town. But instead, after no more than 3 minutes of walking, I passed the statue again. Same missing face, same crack down its torso. And there, not 50 feet away, the gates, the cemetery gates, closed again now, though I never heard them shut. I turned around, walked the other way, slower this time, counting steps, marking landmarks. But again, I came to the angel. Again to the gates. Again to the circle that never broke. A loop. The kind of loop that isn't built by roads, but by something older. Something buried deeper than asphalt and gravel. I started to run, and when I did, the world changed. Street lights that hadn't worked flickered on, but the light they cast was wrong. Not warm, not white, not even electric. It was gray, like the color of ash held under water. Every flicker stretched my shadow long and thin across the cemetery road until I didn't recognize the outline it made. The more I ran, the more things I didn't remember seeing started to appear. Benches where there'd been none. Headstones with names I knew, my father's, my uncle's, even the dog I buried in '97, all clustered together like they'd been waiting for me. Like they were always supposed to be found. Then I saw the hearse. Not where I'd left it, but parked across a small hill near the back of the cemetery, facing away from the gate. Lights off, engine silent. It didn't look like it had driven there. It looked like it had been placed. I approached it slowly. The windows were too dark to see inside. My hand trembled when I reached for the handle. But I had to look. I had to know. Because every fiber of me was screaming that something was behind that wheel. When I opened the door, the driver slumped sideways. It was me, not asleep, not unconscious, dead, skin pale, gray, cold, wearing my uniform shirt, badge still clipped to the collar, my own watch on the wrist, the time frozen at 2:44. In his lap, the dispatch log was open, filled out with clean, perfect handwriting. All my routes, my deliveries, every name I'd ever driven, all accounted for, all complete. Except one. The last line was blank, until I blinked. Then, Slowly, letters bled through the paper like ink drawn from memory. Driver, Charles M. O'Donnell. Time of death, 2:44 a.m. Status, delivery incomplete. I staggered back, but I couldn't run. My legs didn't move. The road didn't move. Only the world did, shifting behind my eyes like pages turning too fast to read. The GPS in the dead man's hearse flickered to life. It showed a single line, no destination, no time, just a sentence burning green across the screen. Until you arrive. I turned in place. The cemetery stretched longer than before. The angel statue now stood in 4 different places at once. I counted headstones and lost track after 100. They kept multiplying, forming rows where no ground had been. I was no longer in a cemetery. I was inside a grave that refused to be filled, and I was the cargo. When I tried to scream, my voice didn't carry. The fog caught it and buried it before it left my throat. I walked for what could have been minutes or years. The road ahead never ended. The same curve, the same statue, the same gate in the distance, always just out of reach. My hands trembled too hard to open my phone. The time wouldn't move anyway. And now, whenever I close my eyes, I'm still driving. Not forward, not backward, just around the same loop, around the same destination that never comes. A coffin in the back, no name, but I know what's in it now. I know who's inside. And every night, I hear the latch click open just a little more. I was never meant to deliver that body. I was meant to become it.